In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one commissar who'll tell you what they never cover at the Schola. The sound a bolt pistol makes when you use it on a provost marshal who has come 1,200 miles to arrest a man you need alive. It's exactly the same sound. The bolt doesn't care whose skull it opens. It performs its function. He always respected things that performed their function without unnecessary sentiment, and that, he suspects, is how all of this started. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story comes from Garin Sult, formerly of the Officio Prefectus, attached to the 91st Hentworth Rifles. The Munitorum will tell you a man snapped, that pressure broke something inside him, words that make it sound like a disease rather than a choice. He didn't snap. Nothing broke. He made a series of decisions, each following from the last, and the chain led somewhere the Imperium does not permit. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. They give you a bolt pistol at commissioning. Standard issue, Esteban pattern, 5.5 pounds unloaded. They put it in your hand on a parade square in front of the rest of your intake year, and they tell you this weapon is the instrument of the Emperor's justice. They tell you it speaks with his voice. They tell you it is the last sound a coward will ever hear, and the first sound a wavering line will remember when it decides to hold. They do not tell you what it sounds like when you use it on a provost marshal who has come 1,200 miles to arrest a man you need alive. They do not cover that at the Schola. I can tell you because I have done it, and the sound is exactly the same. The bolt does not care whose skull it opens. It performs its function. I respected that about it. I always respected things that performed their function without unnecessary sentiment, and I suppose that is how all of this started, and also how it ended, or how it has not ended, depending on your definition of the word. My name is Garin Sult. I was a commissar of the Officio Prefectus, attached to the 91st Hentworth Rifles. I have heard the way the Munitorum tells these stories. They say a man snapped. They say the pressure of command broke something inside him. They use words like corruption and madness because those words make the problem sound like a disease, something that happened to a man rather than something a man chose. I did not snap. Nothing broke. I made a series of decisions, each one following from the last, and the chain led somewhere the Imperium does not permit. That does not make the chain wrong. I was raised at Halecroft, which is a Chola Progenium facility on the world of the same name, a grey little fortress of a place where it rained 10 months out of the 12, and the other 2 it sleeted. I was taken in at 5. My parents were dead, killed in a compliance action on a border world I have never been to and could not find on a chart. The Schola raised me in the usual way, which is to say it stripped me down to components and rebuilt me into something useful. I do not resent this. A bolt pistol does not resent the machinist who bored its barrel. They taught the creed at Halecroft the way they taught weapon drill, by repetition until the hands do it without the head asking permission, and I could recite the whole of it now if anybody wanted to hear it. Nobody ever has. Boys in my intake wept during the devotions, some of them every week for years, and I watched them do it and could not produce the thing itself, and covered the gap with performance. I was made for a purpose, and the purpose was clear. Halecroft turned out commissars the way Hentworth turned out pig iron, in bulk and without much fuss, and the product was reliable, if not decorative. I commissioned at 19, young by most standards, but the wastage rate in the Officio had been high that decade. 3 subsector commands had requested emergency postings in the same fiscal quarter, and the Schola pushed its senior intake through 6 months early to fill the gap. I graduated 4th in a class of 11. The top 3 went to prestigious regiments with histories and battle honors and the kind of lineage that looks good on a commissar's service record. I went to the 91st Hentworth Rifles, because the 91st Hentworth Rifles had burned through 2 commissars in 3 years, and the Munitorum had stopped sending their best. The 91st was not a bad regiment. The Munitorum's version will have told you they were a rabble, a discipline case, a regiment 1 grade away from censure. They were not. They were an ordinary line infantry formation from an ordinary industrial world, 3,800 men at nominal strength, equipped to the standard Munitorum schedule with less guns and flak armor and the absolute minimum of everything else. They fought the way working men fight, which is to say, without elegance and without waste, because they had grown up in a place where both were luxuries. Hentworth is a foundry world, iron and copper and tin. The men had hands like shovels and faces like anvils, and they did not need a commissar to tell them how to stand in a firing line. They needed a commissar because the Munitorum said they needed a commissar, and the Munitorum is not an institution that entertains discussion on the subject. The 2 commissars before me had both been shot, not by the enemy. The official records list combat deaths, which is technically accurate in the sense that both men died during combat, but last bolts fired by the enemy do not enter between a man's shoulder blades, and the Officio Prefectus is not so stupid that it cannot read a wound pattern. The regiment had killed its own commissars, and the response from the commissariat was to send another one. This is how the Imperium solves most of its problems. If the first application of force does not work, apply more force. I understood the principle. I simply intended to be the kind of force that did not need to be applied twice. I arrived on Hentworth for a 6-week attachment before deployment. Colonel Bregenthal met me at the landing field. He was a solid man, 53 years old, gray at the temples, with a face that had been broken and reassembled at least twice. He shook my hand, looked at my sash and my cap and my bolt pistol, and said one thing. He said, "I will give you the same advice I gave the last 2. Stay behind the line, stay out of the way, file your reports, and let the sergeants run the companies." I told him I intended to do no such thing. He looked at me for a long time after that, and then he nodded and said, "Well, the last 2 did not take the advice either, and that is why they are dead." I told him they were dead because they were behind the line when they should have been in front of it. A commissar standing behind a regiment is a target. A commissar standing in front of one is a leader. Tall did not agree with me, but he did not argue, which I later learned was his way with most things. The deployment orders came in the 5th week. Veldaric. I did not know the name. Most line officers did not. Veldaric was a fortress world on the eastern fringe of the Askelon Reach, a moderately important anchor point in a chain of defensive positions that the Munitorum had been reinforcing for 6 years against a threat that kept changing its name, but never changed its nature. The briefing documents called it occultist insurgency, which is the Munitorum's way of saying the enemy worships something other than the Emperor, and we would rather not specify what. The operational summary was 30 pages long and said very little. Estimated enemy strength, 8 to 12,000. Disposition, urban and suburban. Expected campaign duration, 4 to 8 months. Casualty projection, moderate. Moderate is one of those words that covers a great deal of territory when written by a man who has never stood in any. Every number in that briefing was wrong. I do not say this with the benefit of hindsight. I say it because the numbers were wrong when they were written, and the men who wrote them knew they were wrong, and they sent us anyway because the alternative was to write accurate numbers and explain to a Lord General why his campaign projection had been optimistic by a factor of 3. We arrived on Veldarek by bulk carrier after 9 weeks underway. 3,800 men packed into a hold designed for 2,000 in the company of 4 other regiments being funneled into the same theater. We lost 31 men on the crossing. Nobody investigates that. The Navy counts what it loads and the Munitorum counts what it unloads, and the difference is written off against the passage. And 9 weeks sealed in a hold with the lights on a maintenance cycle and the hull working against something that is not water will produce that difference every time. The 91st was the smallest. We were assigned to Sector 12 of the Korashat line, which was the principal defensive perimeter around the fortress city of Veldarek Primus. And, from the landing field to the sector boundary, I saw enough to know that the briefing document was not merely wrong, but fictional. The Korashat line was not a defensive perimeter. It was a scar. It ran for 60 miles around the northern and eastern approaches to the city, through a landscape that had been shelled and burned and shelled again until the ground was powder and the buildings were stumps. The trenches were not trenches. They were gouges in the rubble, connected by communication saps that had been dug, collapsed, dug again, and in some places simply abandoned and replaced by surface runs that offered no cover at all. The men holding them were from regiments I did not recognize, hollow-faced and filthy, and they watched us march past with the expression of men watching a meal being delivered to someone else's table. Behind them, inside the inner perimeter, something over 4 million people were still living in Veldarek Primus and still being tithed for labor, because a fortress city under siege does not stop being a city, it only stops being a good one. We passed work gangs coming down as we went up. They did not look at us at all. The enemy was already in the sector when we arrived, not in force. In pieces. They came in at night, small parties of 8 to 15, through the rubble fields and the collapsed sewer network, and they hit the forward positions with grenades and blades and then pulled back before a response could be organized. The first week, we lost 9 men. The second week, 14. The third week, 22. The casualty rate was not alarming by Guard standards. What was alarming was the pattern. The dead were not killed by lass fire or shrapnel. They were killed by edged weapons at close range, and in several cases, the bodies were mutilated after death in ways that I am not going to describe because description would give the act more significance than it deserves. The enemy wanted us to be afraid. I noted this in my report to Sector Command, and included a recommendation that forward listening posts be doubled and that the sewer grates be welded shut. Sector Command acknowledged the report. They did not act on it. This is the Astra Militarum. A recommendation travels up through channels, is acknowledged, filed, cross-referenced against the operational priority matrix, and forgotten. By the time anyone with the authority to authorize welding has read the request, the requisition for welding equipment has expired and must be resubmitted. By the time it is resubmitted, the men who were supposed to do the welding have been reassigned. The machinery of the Imperium is the first enemy every guardsman faces, and it kills more of them than the actual enemy ever does. The first real engagement came in our 4th week. The Ashen Pact, which is what the enemy called itself, launched a company-strength assault on the forward positions of Sector 12 at 3 in the morning. 300 fighters, approximately, coming through the rubble in a loose crescent formation, screaming. I had heard screaming before in training exercises and in recorded combat drills. This was different. These were not men screaming because they were afraid or because they had been trained to intimidate. These were men screaming because they wanted to be heard, specifically and personally, by something that was not in the trench with us. Divisional intelligence had no note on where the name came from. A week on the Coruscant supplied one, because everything on that line was ash by then, and men swear on whatever happens to be under their hands. I was in the forward line when they hit. I had been walking the positions, which is what I did every night between 2 and 4, because that is when sentries sleep, and that is when a commissar earns his rations. I was 30 yards from the point of contact when the first grenade went off, and I had my bolt pistol in my hand before the debris finished falling. The packed fighters came over the parapet in a wave, and for the next 11 minutes, the world was very small and very loud and very simple. I killed 4 of them. The first with the pistol at a range of about 15 feet. The second with the pistol, closer. The third I shot in the chest and he did not fall, and I shot him again and he fell. The fourth came at me with a chain axe, one of those ugly improvised things the cultist war bands favor, a mining tool with saw teeth welded to a motor housing, and he swung it at my head and I ducked under it and put the muzzle of the pistol against his throat and fired. The bolt went through his neck and detonated somewhere behind him, and I was wearing most of his blood before his body hit the ground. 11 minutes, 4 kills, 67 casualties across the sector, including 9 dead. I filed my report in the morning, cleaned my pistol, cleaned my coat, and ate breakfast. The food was a gray brick of compressed protein and reconstituted starch, and it tasted like chalk, and I remember eating it with appetite, which surprised me. I had expected the aftermath of my first real fight to feel different than it did. I had expected some kind of reaction, a tremor, a reluctance, something. There was nothing. I ate the ration brick and I wrote my report and I went back to the line, and I did not think about the 4 men I had killed because there was nothing to think about. They had come to kill the men in my charge. I had killed them first. The arithmetic was simple. That first engagement established something. I was not a rear echelon commissar. I was not a man who stood behind the firing line and shot the men who flinched. I was in the trench with them, and I fought with them, and the 91st noticed. Soldiers always notice. They are experts at measuring the distance between a man's words and his actions, and a commissar who fights earns a different kind of authority than a commissar who threatens. The first kind is more dangerous, as it turned out, because the men do not merely obey it, they follow it. And a commissar who is followed is a commissar who can lead his men anywhere, including to places the Imperium would very much prefer they did not go. The first 3 months were education. The Ashen Pact fought like nothing in the training manuals. They were not a conventional military force, and they were not a disorganized mob. They were something between, a war band with structure, operating in cells of 8 to 20 that coordinated their actions through a system I could not identify, and the intelligence staff refused to investigate. They attacked at night, and they attacked during bombardments, and they attacked during relief rotations, which meant they had observation on our positions, which meant someone was watching us all the time, and we never found them. Their fighters were a mix of renegade guardsmen from regiments I could not identify, local militia who had gone over to whoever was offering the better deal, and a corps of what I can only describe as professionals. Men who fought with discipline and skill and absolute commitment, and who did not retreat until they had achieved whatever objective they had set for themselves, and then withdrew cleanly, covering their own extraction with fire and movement that would have done credit to a Cadian drill sergeant. The pact took ground. Slowly, methodically, one position at a time. They would isolate a section of trench, cut the communication saps on either side, assault the isolated section with overwhelming local force, kill everyone in it, and then withdraw before reinforcements arrived. They never held what they took. They simply killed everything in it, demolished the positions, and left the wreckage for us to reoccupy. The message was clear. You cannot hold this ground. You will bleed here. The ground is ours whenever we want it, and yours only when we allow it. I admired the efficiency. I admired it professionally, the way an engineer admires a well-designed machine, and I did not question the fact that admiration was the word that came to mind rather than revulsion. The Lord General commanding the Veldaric Theater was a man named Thasik Morvain. I never met him in person. I saw him twice, at a distance, during inspection tours of the Korashat line, a tall figure in a long coat surrounded by staff officers and bodyguards, moving through the rear areas at speed and never stopping at the forward positions. He walked the way men walk who do not want to be in a place long enough to see what it looks like. Morvain had been given command of the Veldaric Theater 9 months before our arrival, and in that time he had committed 11 regiments to the Korashet line and lost the equivalent of 6. The line had not moved in any direction. The Ashen Pact held the rubble fields and the outer districts. The garrison held the inner perimeter and the fortress city. Between them was a strip of destroyed ground about half a mile wide, where nothing lived and nothing grew, and the only things that moved were rats and shells, and the small parties of packed fighters who came through the ruins at night to kill and be killed in the dark. Morvain's strategy, as far as I could determine it from the operational orders that filtered down to sector level, was attrition. Hold the line. Kill the enemy. Wait for them to run out of fighters before we run out of men. That works if the enemy is finite and the exchange rate favors the defender. Neither held. The Ashen Pact was receiving reinforcements from somewhere, fighters arriving through the outer districts in groups of 50 to 100, armed and ready. The exchange rate across the theater was running at 1.3 to 1 in their favor, which meant we were losing 13 men for every 10 of theirs. Over 6 months, across 11 regiments, that arithmetic is a death sentence pronounced 1 decimal point at a time. I put the analysis in my quarterly discipline report, on the grounds that morale is a discipline matter and a campaign with those numbers does not produce men who expect to live. The Commissariat acknowledged it. They did not respond to the analysis. I have since learned that acknowledged is the Commissariat's way of saying received and discarded in the same motion. I filed a second report the following quarter with updated figures. The exchange rate had worsened to 1.5 to 1. It was acknowledged. The office I was filing them with is not in the business of questioning Lord Generals. Its function is to see that their orders are carried out, and whether the orders make sense is not a question it is equipped to hold. I did not confuse my role. I knew exactly what my role was. My role was to keep the 91st Hentworth Rifles in the line and fighting, and to execute any man who refused to do so, and to do this until the regiment was spent, or the campaign was won, or we were all dead, whichever came first. I performed this role efficiently. In the first 6 months on Veldaric, I executed 3 men. Trooper Viskel, who deserted his post during a bombardment and was found hiding in a collapsed cellar 2 streets behind the line. Private Gent, who refused a direct order to advance during a counterattack and had to be dragged out of a foxhole by 2 of his squad mates. And Sergeant Arson, who struck an officer during an argument about ration distribution and had to be put down in front of his platoon before the argument became something worse. 3 executions in 6 months. That is a low number by commissariat standards. Confessor Roderick Camber attended all three, because the Ministorum attends executions, and because Camber would have attended them whether the Ministorum required it or not. He was 61 and had been with the 91st since before most of them were born, a short, wide man with a voice that carried further than mine did, and his function was the opposite of my function, and we both understood that and got along on the strength of it. I ended men. He told them in the last 30 seconds they had that the ending meant something. Neither job works without the other. The regiment was holding together because it respected its chain of command, and because the chain of command included a commissar who stood in the forward trench and bled with them when the pact came calling. But 6 months is a long time, and the arithmetic does not stop, and by the 7th month I could see the thing that every line officer on the Coruscant could see, and that Lord General Morvain either could not see or chose not to see. The campaign was not being won. It was not being lost, either, not in the sudden catastrophic way that campaigns end in the training manuals. It was being drained, slowly, man by man, position by position. The strength was bleeding out of the line, and the replacements were not coming fast enough. And the men who did arrive were younger and greener and less equipped than the men they were replacing. And the Ashen Pact was not getting weaker. The Ashen Pact was getting stronger. Their attacks were more coordinated. Their fighters were better armed. They had begun using heavy weapons, crew-served stubbers, and improvised mortars, things they had not had 6 months ago, and no one on the staff seemed interested in asking where a cultist warband in a siege was acquiring military-grade hardware. I recovered a crew-served stubber from a captured position in the 7th month. The serial plate carried a Munitorum armory stamp dated 14 months prior, which meant the weapon had been manufactured and shipped after the campaign on Veldaric had already begun. Defectors bring their personal kit when they cross. They do not bring equipment that was still in a forge when they changed sides. I reported the serial discrepancy to Divisional Intelligence. They acknowledged the report. Morvain's orders continued to arrive at sector level with the regularity of a metronome. Hold the line. Maintain positions. Conduct local counterattacks to recover lost ground. Do not withdraw under any circumstances. Do not request relief. Relief will be provided according to the operational schedule, which was a document I never saw, and which I suspect did not exist. The 7th month is when the dying changed character. I do not mean the volume of it, although the volume increased. I mean the nature. In the first 6 months, the deaths were military deaths, men killed by enemy action in the course of their duties, and the losses were painful but comprehensible. A man holds a trench. The enemy attacks the trench. The man dies, or the enemy dies. The arithmetic is brutal, but it has the virtue of clarity. What began in the 7th month was something else. Morvain started issuing attack orders. The first one reached Sector 12 on a cold morning in the middle of the wet season, delivered by a staff courier who had never been closer to the front than the signals bunker at Division. The order was straightforward. 2 companies of the 91st, supported by 1 company of the Aramond 100th from the adjacent sector, would advance across the rubble field designated Area 14 and seize a complex of ruined habitation blocks on the far side. Objective Anvil, the order called it. The habitation blocks had been in Ashen Pact hands for 4 months. They were fortified, garrisoned, and covered by at least 2 heavy weapon positions that we had identified and probably 2 more that we had not. The distance across the open ground was 600 yards. There was no cover. There was no armor support. The order specified no armor support. It specified no preliminary bombardment. It specified that the attack would be conducted at dawn, which meant we would be advancing into the sunrise, which meant the enemy gunners would have the light behind them, and we would be silhouettes against the eastern sky. I read the order twice. I read it a third time to make certain I had not missed a supplementary annex or a coordination schedule or some indication that this was a preliminary movement intended to support a larger operation. There was nothing. 2 companies, 600 yards of open ground, fortified enemy positions, no support. Dawn. I went to Colonel Tall. He had already read it. He was sitting behind his desk in the command dugout with the order in front of him and his hands flat on the table, and he was looking at the wall. I said, "This is a death sentence." He said, "It is an order." I said, "The distinction is academic if the men who carry it out are dead." He said nothing for a long time, and then he said, "The order has been acknowledged at divisional level. If we refuse it, they will send someone to carry it out and someone else to shoot us." I said, "If we execute it, the Pact will do the shooting and they will not charge the ammunition to our account." Tall smiled at that. It was the first time I had seen him smile in months, and it was not a happy expression. It was the expression of a man who has just heard the punchline to a joke he had been expecting for a very long time. We executed the order. 2 companies, 412 men, went over the parapet at dawn on the 9th day of the 7th month and advanced into Area 14. I went with them. I went with them because my place is in the advance, not in the trench, and because the men who were about to die deserved a commissar who would die with them, rather than one who would write up their deaths from the safety of a dugout. Major Lessick Orvain led the assault. He was a good officer, competent and calm, and he walked upright across the rubble field because he knew the men were watching him, and a major who runs is a major who teaches his company to run. I walked behind him, not far behind, close enough to hear him working through the litany of the steadfast under his breath, which is what he did when he was frightened. He got as far as the 3rd verse. The heavy stubber that killed Orvain was firing from a 2nd-floor window of the nearest habitation block, about 150 yards ahead. The first burst took him across the chest and spun him sideways, and the second burst caught him as he fell, and I saw the impacts walk up his body from hip to shoulder. He was dead before he finished falling. I did not stop. I did not check him. There was nothing to check. I stepped over him and kept walking, and the men behind me kept walking because the commissar was still walking, and if the commissar had not stopped for the major, then stopping was not an option. We reached the habitation blocks with 209 men out of 412. The rest were dead or wounded in the rubble field behind us. We fought our way into the ground floor of the nearest block, room by room, corridor by corridor, and the Pact fighters defended every meter with blades and shotguns and improvised explosives. And in one room a man came at me with nothing but his hands and his teeth, and I shot him 3 times before he stopped moving. We took the block. It took 4 hours. We held it for 6. Then the Pact counterattacked from 3 directions with fresh fighters, and we were driven back across the rubble field we had already crossed once, except now the rubble field was full of our own dead, and we had to step over them on the way back. 131 men returned to the Coruscant line out of the 412 who had left it. Major Orvain was dead. Captain Drescht was dead. Lieutenants Selik and Farhani were dead. Sergeant Massin, who had been with the regiment for 14 years and was the best non-commissioned officer I had ever served with, lost his left arm to a chain axe and bled out in the communication sap before the Medici could reach him. I had known Massin for 7 months. He had taught me more about infantry combat than the Schola had taught me in 14 years. He told me once that the secret to surviving a firefight is knowing which sounds to ignore. And the secret to surviving a career is knowing which orders to ignore. And the difference between the two is that ignoring the wrong sound kills you immediately, and ignoring the wrong order kills you eventually. I wrote his name in my casualty report, and I did not write anything else about him because a casualty report is not a eulogy, and the Munitorum does not read eulogies. Morvain sent a commendation for the action at Area 14. The commendation said the assault had achieved its objective, which was technically true in the sense that we had occupied the habitation blocks for 6 hours before being driven out. The commendation did not mention the 281 casualties. It did not mention that the ground we had taken was now back in enemy hands. It mentioned nothing at all about the fact that the assault had achieved precisely 0 strategic value at a cost of 68% of the committed force. The commendation was printed on heavy cream-colored paper with the Lord General's seal embossed in gold at the top, and I used it to light a fire in my dugout that evening because it was cold and I was out of fuel tablets and the paper burned well. The second attack order came 11 days later. Objective Bastion. Different sector, same arithmetic. 3 companies this time, 1 from the 91st and 2 from the Ermond 100th. The target was a fortified intersection the Pact had been holding for 5 months. No armor support, no preliminary bombardment. Dawn assault. I did not go too tall with this one because there was nothing to say that we had not already said. I went to the line and I told Sergeant Vilsk, who had inherited Massin's platoon, that we were going over the top in the morning and that the men should eat well tonight because half of them would not need breakfast. Vilsk was 26 years old and had been a sergeant for 3 weeks. He had worked a casting floor on Hentworth before the tithe took him, and he still wore his own foundry gauntlets over the Munitorum issue because the issue pair was cut for men with smaller hands than his. He looked at me with an expression that I had seen on the faces of animals in slaughterhouses on Hentworth, that flat blank look of something that knows what is coming and has decided not to waste energy on fear. He said, "How many are we losing this time?" I said, "Based on the last engagement, between 50 and 70%. He said, "And the point of it?" I said, "The Lord General requires it." He said nothing else. He turned around and went to his platoon, and I heard him telling them to check their equipment and get some sleep. And I stood in the communication sap and listened to the sounds of 300 men preparing to die for an intersection they would hold for a few hours and then lose. And something in the back of my skull made a sound like a door closing. It was not conscience. It was waste. Trained soldiers who had survived 7 months on the Coruscant against an enemy that had killed better men than them, and Morvain was spending them the way a drunk spends coin, for the brief satisfaction of watching something happen. Men advanced. Men died. Ground was taken. Ground was lost. The Pact came back, and the commendation came in, and the next order came down. It was the anger of a man watching an amateur ruin good material, and the material was mine. Objective Bastion cost us another 116 men. We held the intersection for 9 hours. The Pact took it back before nightfall. The commendation arrived 2 days later on the same cream-colored paper. I burned it with the first one's ashes still in the fire pit. The third attack order came 3 weeks after the second. The fourth came 2 weeks after the third. The fifth came 9 days after the fourth. Each one was the same. Different objective, same structure, same absence of support, same dawn assault into prepared positions, same 60 to 70% casualties, same commendation, same result. Nothing taken. Nothing held, nothing gained. By the end of the 9th month, the 91st Hentworth Rifles had lost 1,400 men out of its original 3,800. Replacements had brought us back up to about 2,900, but the replacements were green, most of them conscripts from hive worlds who had never held a last gun before their transport, and who died in their first engagement with the same regularity as rainwater hitting a hot stove. The Munitorum was replacing veterans with children and charging the same shipping rate for both. The experienced corps, the Hentworth men, the foundry workers with hands like shovels who had held Sector 12 through the first 6 months, were being used up, and every casualty report I filed went into the same void that every recommendation and every analysis had gone into, and the void did not answer, and the orders kept coming. I executed 5 more men during this period, all 5 for refusal to advance. The first 3, months earlier, had required a decision, a moment, however brief, in which I had to choose to pull the trigger. By the 9th month, there was no moment. The man refused. I drew. I fired. I would holster and move on, and the body would be carried away, and the platoon would advance. He had refused his function. I had performed mine. I could look at a firing line of 300 men and work out how many would be dead by evening, with about as much disturbance as a quartermaster ordering ration packs. They were numbers. The living were numbers that had not yet become dead numbers, and my job was to keep them moving forward until they did, or until the campaign ended, and the campaign was not ending. The change happened gradually, and I did not notice it happening, and by the time I might have noticed it, there was nothing left to notice with. The Schola teaches you to be hard. The Commissariat teaches you to be harder. Veldaric taught me to be something else entirely, something that the Schola does not have a word for, because the Schola does not admit that it is possible. The Schola teaches that discipline is the Emperor's gift, and that the Commissar is the vessel through which that gift is delivered. Veldaric taught me that discipline is a tool, and a tool does not care who holds it, and the hand that picks it up is the hand that owns it. By the 9th month, I had begun to notice something else. The Ashen Pact's fighters, the ones who came through the rubble at night with their chain axes and their screaming, were not all cultists. Some of them were soldiers, real soldiers with real training, wearing modified guard-issue flak armor and carrying weapons that had Munitorum stampings on the barrels. I captured one during a trench raid in the middle of the 8th month. He was wounded, a lass bolt through the thigh, and Vilsk's men dragged him into the communication sap before his squad could recover him. I interrogated him myself because the intelligence staff at Division had a 12-day backlog on prisoner processing, and I did not have 12 days. The man was a corporal. He had been a corporal in the Crevaald 62nd, a regiment that had been deployed to Veldorek 18 months before the 91st arrived, and that had, according to the Munitorum records, been destroyed in action during the 5th month of the campaign. Every man on the regiment's roll was listed as killed in action. The corporal sitting in front of me, bleeding into the mud of my communication sap, was officially a dead man. I asked him how a dead man came to be wearing pact colors and carrying a pact weapon. He told me. He told me in simple, flat language, without defiance and without shame, the way a man describes a job he has done many times. The 62nd had been ground down the same way the 91st was being ground down. The same orders, the same suicidal assaults, the same commendations for operations that achieved nothing, the same arithmetic, 1.3, 1.5, 1.7 casualties for every enemy killed, until the regiment was a shell and the survivors were men who had stopped believing that the Imperium intended for them to survive. The pact had come to them in the night, not to kill them, but to talk to them. They had offered a simple proposition. Stop dying for nothing. Start fighting for something. It took me most of the way through that account to work out that he was not being interrogated and he was not confessing. He was working. A man with a last bolt through his thigh, bleeding into the floor of my own communication sap, was delivering a recruitment address, and he was delivering it past the men, holding him and directly at me, because he had served in a regiment with a commissar in it, and he knew exactly which part of the structure was load-bearing. He never told me what the something worth fighting for actually was. He did not need to, and he knew he did not need to. He let me look at his face instead, which was clear and calm and completely free of the hollow exhaustion I saw in my own men every day, and he left me to draw the conclusion without assistance, which is how that trade is done properly. I shot him. I put the bolt through his forehead at a range of about 2 feet, and I filed a report stating that the prisoner had died of his wounds during interrogation, which was standard practice when a prisoner says things that a commissar does not want in the intelligence file. What I left out of the report, and out of every report after it, was that the man had been recruiting, and that the recruitment had been aimed at me, and that I had let him finish. I filed it, and I went back to the line, and I did not think about the corporal, or I told myself I did not think about him, which is not the same thing. In the 10th month, Morvain issued the order that broke everything. Operation Harrower. The operational plan was 6 pages long and specified that 4 regiments, including the 91st, would conduct a simultaneous assault on the bastion of Relgard, which was the Ashen Pact's primary fortified position on the eastern approach to the Korashit line. Relgard was a fortress within a fortress, a massive hab-block complex that the Pact had been fortifying for over a year. It had walls, it had gun emplacements, it had tunnels, supply routes, and a garrison estimated at between 2,000 and 3,000 fighters. The assault plan called for 4,000 Imperial troops to advance across open ground, without armor, without air support, without preliminary bombardment, and take Relgard by storm. The timeline gave us 18 hours to secure the objective. The casualty projection, written in Morvain's own hand on the final page, read acceptable. I read the plan. I read it again. I looked at the map. I looked at the ground. I had been looking at Relgard through a field scope for 7 months, and I knew every window, every gun port, every meter of the approach. And I knew with the certainty of a man who has been killing and being killed on this ground for the better part of a year that the assault would fail. Not might fail, would fail. The numbers were not close. 4,000 men against a fortified position with 2,000 to 3,000 defenders across open ground with no support is not a battle. It is a sentence. The casualty rate would not be 60 or 70%. It would be 90. It would be higher. And the survivors, if there were survivors, would reach Relgard's walls with nothing left to fight with, and the Pact would kill them at the gate. I went to Tal. Tal was not alone. He was in the command dugout with his remaining company commanders, Captains Herek and Noldane, and a man named Vosser, who had been a lieutenant 3 weeks ago and was now a captain because the 2 men above him were dead. 3 captains for a regiment that had once fielded 14. The rest of the companies were being run by lieutenants who should have been platoon commanders and sergeants who should have been section leaders, and every one of them was doing a job 2 ranks above the one he had been trained for. They were standing around the map table, and they were not talking, and the silence in that room was the loudest thing I had heard on Veldaric. Tal looked at me when I came in. He had the operation order in his hand. He said, "You have read it." I said, "I have read it." He said, "And your assessment?" I said, "It is not an assessment. An assessment implies uncertainty. There is no uncertainty. This order will kill the regiment." Herek, who was the oldest of the surviving officers and who had a scar across his face from a packed chain axe that had missed his skull by the width of a finger, said something I am not going to repeat because it was directed at Morvain, and it involved anatomical specifics that are not relevant to this account. Noldane said nothing. Vosser, who was 24 and had been in command of a company for less than a month, looked like a man standing on the edge of something high. Tal put the order on the table. He smoothed it flat. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "I am going to refuse this order." The room went very quiet. Tal did not look at me when he said it. He did not need to. Everyone in that room knew what a refused order meant, and everyone in that room knew what the Commissar's duty was when a commanding officer refused an order. I was supposed to draw my pistol and shoot Bragan Tal through the head and assume command of the regiment and execute the assault on Relgart myself. That is the regulation. That is the function. That is what the bolt pistol is for. I did not draw. I stood in that dugout with 4 officers looking at me, 3 of them waiting for me to kill their colonel, and 1 of them waiting for me to kill him, and I did not draw. The moment stretched. Herek's hand moved toward his sidearm, very slowly, and I saw Noldane shift his weight. They were preparing. If I drew on Tal, they were going to draw on me. They had decided this before I entered the room. The consultation I had walked in on was not about whether to refuse the order. It was about what to do with the Commissar when they did. I said, "The order is militarily unsound." I said it in the flat, procedural voice that the Schola teaches, the voice of official pronouncement, because official pronouncements have legal weight, and what I was about to do needed every gram of legal cover I could manufacture. I said, "The order specifies an assault on a fortified position without adequate support, in conditions that guarantee catastrophic loss of the committed force, with no realistic prospect of achieving the stated objective. As the Commissar attached to this regiment, it is my duty to ensure that the fighting effectiveness of this formation is maintained. An order that will destroy the regiment is an order that contradicts my mandate. I am entering a formal objection to Operation Harrower in the regimental log and requesting an immediate review by the Sector Commissariat." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I could hear my own heartbeat, which was steady, which surprised me, because what I had just done was mutiny. The language I had used, the procedural framing, the reference to mandate and formal objection, all of that was window dressing. I had been ordered to ensure compliance with Operation Harrower, and I had chosen not to comply. Tal looked at me. He nodded. Just once. Just a small motion of the head, and it was the most dangerous gesture I had ever seen a man make, because it meant we were in this together, and together is not a word that commissars use. We did not attack Relgart. The 91st stayed in its positions. What was left of the 3 other regiments went in without us, 3,000 men across the open ground, and I stood on the parapet of the forward trench and watched them advance into the killing field. 8 minutes. 8 minutes from the first last bolt to the point where the entire formation simply stopped moving. Not because anyone gave an order to stop, but because the men in front were dead, and the men behind were walking into the dead, and there was nowhere to go except forward into more death or backward into the commissars who would shoot them for retreating. I watched the Ashen-Pact's gun positions sweep the field in long, methodical traverses, the heavy stubbers and the autocannons working in overlapping arcs, and the sound of it was like a mill running, that steady rhythmic grinding that means something is being processed. And the something was 3,000 men. 1,100 came back. The rest were in the rubble field, dead or dying, and the Pact held Relgart, and the commendation would arrive in a few days on cream-colored paper. They came back through us. Sector 12 held the nearest re-entrant, and a man crawling 600 yards on his elbows does not get to choose his direction. We put out water and stretcher parties, and we carried them in over our own parapet, hundreds of them, for most of a day. Not one of them said anything to us about the fact that we had stood on that parapet and watched. Two of them spat. A sergeant of the Aramond 100th, with his hand gone at the wrist, looked at my sash for a while, from a stretcher with two of my own men holding the poles, and then looked away without changing his expression. That was the entire reckoning, and it was considerably worse than being shouted at. I stood in the sap and let it happen to me, and I felt nothing at all except the anger. And the anger was clean and bright, and the only thing inside me that still felt like it belonged to a living man. The response came in 4 days. Not a commendation. A provost detachment, 20 officers of the Provost Corps, and 40 military police troopers, under the command of Provost Marshal Hannert Drossik. They arrived in the rear area at mid-morning. They had flown into the divisional strip at first light, 1,200 miles from the theater provost command, in a single night, and come the last stretch by road in a convoy of 6 chimeras, and they formed up in the assembly area behind Sector 12, with their weapons drawn and their carapace armor polished and their faces set in the expression of men who have been given a simple task and intend to complete it quickly. His boots were clean. Nobody on the Corps Chat had clean boots. I met Drossik in the communications sap between the rear area and the command dugout. He was a tall man, very thin, with a face like a blade and a uniform that had never been within a mile of the front line. He told me he carried a warrant for the arrest of Colonel Bregenthal on charges of dereliction of duty, refusal to obey a lawful order, and conduct prejudicial to the discipline of His Majesty's forces. He told me that I was ordered to surrender my sidearm and submit to arrest pending an investigation into my failure to enforce compliance with Operation Harrower. He told me this in a voice that was clipped and precise and utterly devoid of any awareness that he was standing in a trench where men had died by the hundred for 10 months. He recited the warrant number and the authorization code and the chain of approval that ran from Morvain's staff through the Commissariat Sector Office and back down to the Provost Division. And while he was reciting it, I was looking past him at the 60 men he had brought with him. 60 clean, well-fed, well-equipped men who had never fired a shot in anger on this world. And the anger made that sound again, the one like a door closing, except this time it was not a door. It was a lock. I said, "Provost Marshal Drossik, are you aware that the operation whose refusal forms the basis of this warrant resulted in the destruction of 3 regiments with no tactical gain?" He said, "The merits of the operation are not within my remit." I said, "Are you aware that your warrant was issued by a Lord General whose orders have cost this theater approximately 6,000 casualties in the last 4 months, with 0 strategic progress?" He said, "I am here to execute the warrant, Commissar. The operational conduct of the theater command is not relevant to my duties." I said, "It is relevant to mine." He did not understand what I meant. He was still working it out when I drew. The bolt took him in the center of the chest, just above the gorget of his carapace armor, where the neck seal meets the collar, and it detonated inside him and he came apart from the collarbones up. I had not aimed for the chest. I had aimed for the throat. The fact that I hit center mass meant my hand was not as steady as I had thought, and that bothered me more than the killing did. The 60 men behind Drossik had about 3 seconds to react. In those 3 seconds, Sergeant Vilsk brought his platoon out of the secondary trench and opened fire. Vilsk had been waiting. I had told him to wait, which meant I had planned this, which meant the killing of Honert Drossik was not a spontaneous act of defiance but a premeditated ambush. The Munitorum's version will describe a commissar who snapped under pressure. I planned it. I gave the order. Vilsk executed the flanking element, and I killed the commander, and the whole thing lasted less than a minute. 41 of the 60 provost troops died in the communication sap. 12 surrendered. 7 ran. Of the 12 who surrendered, I gave them a choice. Join the 91st or walk back to division and report what had happened. 8 joined. 4 chose to walk. I let them go. I needed division to know. Not because I wanted to make a statement, but because a dead provost detachment with no explanation creates ambiguity, and ambiguity invites a second detachment. A report from 4 survivors telling division exactly what had happened, that the commissar of the 91st had killed the provost marshal and declared the regiment's independence from Lord General Morvain's command, that creates clarity. Morvain would have to respond, and his response would take time, and time was what I needed. There was no vote, no consultation with the officers, no dramatic speech in front of the assembled regiment. Confessor Camber came to find me while Vilsk's platoon was still stripping the provost troops of their carapace armor and ammunition. He had heard the shooting. He looked at Drossik, or at the part of Drossik that was still recognizable, and then he looked at me and asked me one question, which was whether I intended to bring the regiment back. I told him no. He nodded as though I had confirmed a diagnosis he had already made. He said, "I have buried 900 of them on this world, and I told every one of them it meant something." He said, "I am not going to start lying now." He said he would be walking west to the garrison lines in the morning, and he would be telling them all of it, because that was his function, and he had not failed to perform it in 40 years, and did not propose to start. I could have let him walk. 4 provost troopers were already walking, and I had sent them deliberately. 1 more man on that road changed nothing operationally. I shot him anyway in the communication sap at a range of about 4 feet, and the men who saw it did not say anything and did not look at each other, and that silence was louder than anything Camber had ever preached from the top of a ration crate. That was not the moment. The moment was 7 months earlier. Camber was the last piece of the old arrangement still standing, and I took it down. Tall heard the shooting from the command dugout and came out to find both bodies in the communication sap. He looked at Drossik, then he looked at Camber for a considerably longer time, because a dead provost marshal is a problem and a dead confessor is something else, and Tall had known the man for 16 years. He looked at me last. He said, "You have killed us." I said, "Morvain was killing you already. I am simply changing the schedule." He said, "What happens now?" I said, "Now we stop dying for nothing and start killing for something." 9 men left the regiment that night. Not in a body, not as a protest, just gone in 1s and 2s out of the forward positions while the sentries found other things to look at. I had the number by morning, and I did not send anybody after them. Every one of them was walking west across 4 miles of rubble field that the Ashen Pact had been working every night for 10 months, and I had spent 7 of those months writing reports about what the Pact did with men it caught in the open. There was no need to send anybody after them. Tall accepted it, not because he agreed, but because the situation had moved past the point where agreement mattered. The 91st Hentworth Rifles was now a mutinous formation. The Commissariat, the Provost Corps, the Lord General's staff, and every loyal regiment on Veldaric would be hunting us within days. We could not go back to the line. We could not surrender. We could not stay on the surface. Morvain had chimeras, Lehman Russ, vultures, the heavy assets he had been hoarding for a counter-offensive that existed only in his operational fantasy and in the quarterly reports he filed to Sector Command. All of that would be turned on us the moment Division confirmed the Provost detachment was dead, and 2,600 infantry in the open against armor is not a fight. It is a calculation. But none of those assets could follow us underground. I had been requesting permission to operate in the Undercroft for 6 months. I knew the breach points, the Pact's entry routes, the sewer accesses Vilsk's men had mapped during trench raids. I knew the garrison commander had refused to send troops down there because the tunnels were unmapped and unmappable, and he could not control what he could not see. That was the point. If the garrison could not see us, the garrison could not kill us. And the Pact was down there, and the Pact's supply lines were down there, and the stubber with the 2 recent serial stamp was down there, and I intended to find out where it had come from. The Undercroft was what the engineers called the tunnel network beneath Veldaric Primus. Every fortress world has one. A lattice of subsurface infrastructure, sewer lines, utility conduits, transit tunnels, shelter networks, maintenance passages, the kind of architecture that accumulates over centuries of fortification and is never fully mapped because every generation adds to it and nobody removes anything. The Undercroft beneath the Korashat had been sealed by the garrison commander at the start of the campaign, the entrances blocked with concrete and razor wire, and declared off-limits by standing order. The Pact had been using it anyway. Their raiding parties came up through breaks in the sealed sections, through cracks and collapses and openings that the garrison had not found, and every request I had filed to clear the tunnels had been returned with the same stamp. Denied. I did not request permission. I took the regiment into the Undercroft through a breach in the sewer line that Vilsk's men had identified during a trench raid 3 months earlier. In my 3rd week on Veldaric, I had asked for those grates to be sealed. The request came back acknowledged, which by then I had learned to read correctly, and I went down through the gap their inaction had left me. At the time, I did not find that funny. We went underground on the morning of the 2nd day after the Provost killing, 2,600 men in a column that stretched for half a mile through tunnels that were 5 feet wide. We carried 5 days of rations, and after that, the Pact's supply crates sustained us. The air smelled of rust and rot and something else. Something underneath the rot, something I could not identify and did not try to identify, because identification would have required me to think about it, and I had stopped thinking about things that did not require immediate action. The first 48 hours in the Undercroft were the worst fighting I had experienced on Veldaric. The Pact had positions down there, checkpoints and strong points and ambush sites that they had been building for months, and they fought for them with the same methodical ferocity that they brought to everything. The tunnels were too narrow for squad-level tactics. Every engagement was a knife fight, 2 men in a space too small to swing a rifle, and the bolt pistol was useless at the ranges we were fighting because a bolt detonates on impact, and in a 5-foot tunnel, the shrapnel kills the man behind the target as reliably as the man in front. I stopped using the pistol on the 2nd day. I drew the chainsword I had been carrying on my hip since commissioning and had used exactly once in 10 months. And I discovered something about myself that I had not known. I was very good with a blade. Not good in the way that a trained officer is good, competent, adequate, able to defend himself in close quarters. Good in the way that a natural is good. The sword moved in my hands the way a pen moves in a scribe's hands, with a fluency that owed nothing to training and everything to something older and deeper and less comfortable than training. I killed 11 men in the first 2 days of the Undercroft fighting. I remember every one. Not their faces, not their names, not the sounds they made. I remember the geometry, the angle of the cut, the pivot of the wrist, the placement of the feet, the distance between my body and theirs at the moment of contact. I remember the way the chainsword's teeth caught on flak armor and the adjustment I made to cut above the collar rather than through the chest plate. I remember the way a body falls in a tunnel, sideways against the wall, and the way you have to step over it immediately because the next fighter is 2 paces behind and the tunnel does not give you room to wait. 11 kills in 48 hours, all at blade range. And when I cleaned the chainsword on the evening of the second day, I caught myself running my thumb along the teeth the way a musician runs his fingers along the strings of an instrument, checking the tension, testing the edge, the way a man checks a tool he intends to keep. I did not name it. I did not examine it. I cleaned the sword, checked the men, set the watch, and went to sleep standing up in a tunnel junction with the sword in my hand and the sound of dripping water and distant gunfire in my ears. And I slept well. I slept better than I had slept in months. They tried to talk to us on the second night. A voice came out of a side passage about 40 yards ahead of the point element, speaking low Gothic with the flat local vowels, and it said the things the Creviald corporal had said to me in my own communication sap 8 weeks earlier, that we were being spent, that the Imperium had already entered us in a ledger as expended, that there was somewhere to go and something worth the going, and that nobody down here would ever ask us to walk 600 yards into prepared guns at dawn for a piece of paper with a gold seal on it. It was a good offer. It was very close to the offer I would have made in their position. I had Vilsk put a platoon's worth of fire into that passage on a 5-second burst, and we went forward over whatever was left. I did not answer them. A man who answers is a man who is considering it, and I was not considering it. The Crevaldi's 62nd had taken that offer and had become somebody else's regiment. I had not brought 2,600 men underground to be absorbed by anyone. Morvain did send men after us. 2 companies of the Aramond 100th were put into the Undercroft through the sealed entrances behind Sector 9, with orders to locate and destroy a mutinous formation in terrain that nobody had ever mapped. We never met them. We found them, a long time afterwards, in a side passage off the main run, 13 bodies in Imperial flak with their weapons still slung and their lamps burned out beside them. They had not been killed by us. They had not been killed by the Pact. They had walked in the dark until they stopped walking. Nobody else came down after that, and I understood the arithmetic behind the decision because I would have run it the same way. Men are cheaper than a mistake somebody has to explain in writing. We pushed east through the Undercroft for 5 days, fighting our way through packed positions and collapsed sections and flooded passages where the water was chest deep and black, and something moved beneath the surface that I ordered the men not to look at. We lost 300 men in those 5 days, killed in tunnel fights, crushed by collapses, drowned in the flooded sections, or simply gone. Men who were in the column at one rest stop and not in it at the next vanished into the dark without a sound, and the men behind them did not always notice because the tunnels were lightless and the column was strung out, and the human mind stops counting after a while when every count is lower than the last. Some of that was not loss. Some of them had heard the voice in the passage and had gone to find it. And I knew that at the time and let it happen, because a man who wants to belong to somebody else is already no use to me, and the Pact was welcome to find out what it had bought. On the 5th day, we found the junction. It was a massive space by Undercroft standards, a confluence of 6 major tunnel systems meeting at a vaulted chamber that must have been an underground transit hub at some point in Veldarek's history. The ceiling was 30 feet high and the floor was 50 yards across, and the walls were lined with archways that opened into corridors running in every direction. The chamber was empty, completely empty. No packed fighters, no defenses, no fortifications, no sign that anyone had been here in years, except for one thing. The floor was covered in blood. Not fresh blood, old blood, layers of it. The stone beneath was dark granite, and the blood had soaked into it over what must have been months or years, staining it in concentric patterns that radiated outward from the center of the chamber like growth rings on a tree. The air tasted like copper. The walls were marked with symbols that I did not recognize, crude angular shapes cut into the stone with something sharp. Hundreds of them, thousands, covering every surface from floor to ceiling in a dense overlapping script that looked like language but was not any language I had been taught to read. The column stopped at the archway, not on an order. It simply stopped the way water stops at a lip, and the men at the front would not go in, and the men behind them could not see why, and the whole thing began to back up into the tunnel. I went forward. A trooper named Prade was standing 4 feet inside the chamber, with his last gun held across his chest, and he was working through a prayer I recognized, one of Camber's, the short one for ground that has been used for something. He said it twice. Then he said he was not going any further into that place, and that nobody else should either. He was correct. It was the last correct thing anybody in the 91st said out loud on Veldarek. I shot him where he stood, in front of 400 men, and his blood went onto the floor and did not spread the way spilled blood spreads. It ran. It went away from him in a straight line toward the middle of the chamber as though the floor had been built to take it, and I watched it go, and I did not understand yet what I was watching. The column came through the archway after that, and nobody else stopped. And of all the things I put into that room, he was the first. 9 men had walked out on me the night I shot Camber. Nobody walked out on me for Prade. We were 5 days into a tunnel system with no map and no exit that anybody had located. And a man who leaves a column down there is not deserting. He is selecting a slower method, and every one of them understood that. That is not obedience, and I have never confused the two. Corporal Dorthin found the supply crates. They were stacked in one of the side corridors, standard Munitorum containers, olive drab plasteel with transit markings and lot numbers, and destination codes stenciled in white. Dorthin called me over and I read the markings twice, and then I read them a third time, and I found that I had put my hand flat on the crate lid without deciding to, the way a man steadies himself on a table. The pact drew from this place and posted nobody on it, which struck me at the time as poor security and turned out to be nothing of the kind. The destination codes were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of misdirected, a crate sent to the wrong sector, the kind of logistical error that happens 10,000 times a day in the Munitorum's supply network. Wrong in the sense that the same crate had 2 destination codes. One was for the garrison quartermaster at the Korashad line, supply section 12, which was our section. The other was for a designator I did not recognize, a code that did not match any unit in the theater order of battle. The crates contained ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and weapon components. Standard issue Imperial materiel, the same materiel that the garrison had been receiving through legitimate supply channels for the duration of the campaign. And it was here, in a tunnel network that the garrison commander had sealed and declared off-limits, stacked in orderly rows next to a floor covered in blood that was older than the campaign. I followed the supply corridor. It ran east for approximately 400 yards, straight and level, and it was not a natural tunnel or a collapsed sewer line. It was engineered. Cut stone walls, reinforced ceiling, drainage channels in the floor. It had been built to move material, and it had been moving material for a long time. The corridor opened into a loading bay, and in the loading bay I found the dead. 14 Munitorum supply clerks wearing the gray uniforms of the Departamento Munitorum's logistics division, sitting at their desks in a row. They had been dead for a long time. The bodies were desiccated, dried out by the tunnel air, and they were still sitting upright in their chairs with their hands on their cogitator terminals, and their eyes open and their mouths closed. They had not been killed by violence. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. They were simply dead, and they had been dead for months, possibly for over a year, and the supply systems they administered were still running. The cogitators were still active. The transit schedules were still processing. Crates were still arriving through automated conveyor systems from a depot somewhere deeper in the Undercroft, still being routed and logged and manifested and distributed through a network that nobody was supervising because the people who were supposed to supervise it were corpses who had forgotten to stop filing. The Munitorum would have been impressed by their continued output if the Munitorum had known they were dead. It did not. The cogitator filing their supply manifests was also filing their performance reviews. The supply network served both sides. The same depot, the same conveyor system, the same routing cogitators. One channel fed the garrison at the Korashat line. A second channel, running through a parallel set of tunnels that branched off the main corridor about 200 yards before the loading bay, fed the Ashen Pact. The crates going to both sides came from the same source, contained the same material, and were logged in the same manifest under different destination codes. The Imperium was supplying its own enemy, not through treachery, not through corruption, through machinery, through a system that had been set up to supply a garrison and had been modified at some point before the campaign began to supply 2 recipients instead of 1. Someone had added the second destination code, someone with access to the routing cogitators and knowledge of the tunnel network and a reason to ensure that the fighting never stopped for lack of ammunition. I did not know who. I did not care. The system had been running ever since, and nobody on either side had looked closely enough to notice because nobody on either side talked to the quartermasters, and the quartermasters were dead. But that was not the thing. That was logistics. And logistics can be explained by incompetence and institutional rot, and the Imperium has plenty of both. The thing was the chamber. The chamber with the blood on the floor and the symbols on the walls. Because the supply corridors fed the chamber first. Everything that came through the depot passed through that junction before being routed to the garrison or the Pact, and the blood on the floor was not spilled at random. It was collected. Nobody stood guard over the chamber because nobody posts a sentry on an altar. There were channels cut into the stone, fine grooves that ran from every archway toward the center of the chamber, and at the center there was a drain, and the drain was open, and I could not see the bottom. I stood at the edge of that drain, and I looked down into it, and the dark looked back. Not metaphorically. Something was down there, something that was aware of me in the way that a furnace is aware of fuel, not with intelligence, not with interest, but with appetite. The campaign on Veldarek, the siege, the endless grinding attrition, the suicidal assaults, the reinforcements that kept coming, and the enemy that never weakened, all of it fed the drain. Every man who died on the Korashat line, Imperial or Pact, fed the drain. The fortress had been built with drainage, as all fortresses are, Runoff channels beneath the fighting positions, sluice grates under the Medicae stations, washed-down culverts in the mortuaries, and under all of that, the ordinary plumbing of 4 million people who had been living and working and dying in the inner districts for the whole of the siege and for the 600 years before it. All of it flowing downward through the infrastructure into the undercroft the way sewage flows in any city. Except the drains did not lead to a treatment works. They led here. The blood of both armies, mixed with rainwater and filth and the gray runoff of a siege, flowed through the fortress's own plumbing into the chamber and through the grooves and into the drain, and whatever was at the bottom was drinking. Had been drinking for years, decades, longer. Veldaric was not a fortress world that was under siege. Veldaric was a mouth, and the siege was the chewing. A man is supposed to feel revulsion standing over a thing like that, in the bowels of a world engineered as an abattoir. It did not arrive. What arrived was the thing that had been burning in my chest since the 7th month, and down there, with the dark looking back, it stopped being anger and started being appetite. A loyal commissar would have fought back to the Koreshat and handed it to the commissariat. I considered that for about the length of a breath, because the Ordo's response time is measured in years, and the drain's appetite is measured in liters per day, and the arithmetic did not balance. The Imperium does not respond to information. It responds to force. I could be force. We went hunting. The objective was Relgart. Whoever held Relgart held the Eastern Undercroft, and whoever held the Eastern Undercroft held the chamber and the depot and every run of tunnel that fed them. I had stopped wanting to survive the campaign somewhere around the 7th month. What I wanted now was the pipework. I split the regiment into 4 columns of just under 600 men each, with Tal commanding the first column, Herrick the second, Noldane the third, and myself leading the fourth. Tal took the assignment without comment. A colonel accepting a disposition from his commissar is not a thing that happens in the Astra Militarum, and neither of us remarked on it, and that was the moment the chain of command on Veldaric finished turning over. I sent the columns through the Undercroft in a pattern, east and south, pushing toward the Pact's strong points. Herrick's column hit a fortified choke point on the 3rd day, and Herrick took a shotgun blast to the chest at 2 yards and was dead before his men could pull him back. Vosser, who had been leading the rear guard, caught a grenade on the same day and died without making a sound that anyone heard over the fighting. Noldane absorbed the survivors and pushed on. We fought every step. The Pact held the eastern tunnels in depth, layers of positions backed by reserves who knew the passages the way rats know their runs, and clearing them was butchery. Slow, wet, close-quarters butchery in the dark, the kind of fighting where a man's skill matters less than his willingness to push forward into the next corridor, and the corridor after that, and the one after that. And the only rest is when the enemy pulls back far enough to reload. I did not rest. I went forward with the 4th column, and I killed. The chainsword was slick from hilt to tip, and I stopped cleaning it because the blood dried and caked on the teeth and gave them a roughness that bit deeper than the factory edge. And the absurdity of that, a weapon performing better because it was filthy, struck me as the funniest thing I had encountered on Veldaric, and I laughed in the tunnel, and the men near me looked at me, and the look on their faces was not confusion or concern. It was recognition. They had heard that laugh before. They had heard it from the Pact fighters in the dark, the men who screamed not because they were afraid, but because they were announcing themselves to something that was listening. And now their commissar was making the same sound, and the difference between the two sides of this war had just become very small. Tall came to me on the 8th day underground. He found me in a cleared junction, sitting on a packed barricade with my chainsword across my knees and 3 dead men at my feet. He said, "The men are changing." I said, "Yes." He said, "Dorthan's squad has started taking trophies. They are cutting the hands off the dead and stringing them on wire." I said, "I know." He said, "Are you going to stop it?" I said, "No." He said nothing for a while. He looked at the 3 dead men and at the sword and at me, and his face was doing something complicated. Then he said, "What are we becoming?" I said, "Effective." It was not a good answer. It was an honest one. The regiment was becoming effective in a way that no regiment in the Astra Militarum is permitted to be effective, because the Astra Militarum's definition of effectiveness includes obedience and restraint, and the recognition that there are things soldiers do not do even to the enemy, and the regiment had stopped recognizing those limits. The men who had been foundry workers and quarrymen from Hentworth, men who had endured 10 months of grinding attrition on the Koreshart line without complaint, men who had watched their friends die in pointless assaults, and had buried them and moved on and kept fighting because that is what soldiers do. Those men were now something different. They still fought with discipline. They still obeyed orders. They still held their positions and maintained their weapons and stood their watches. But the quality of the obedience had changed. It was no longer the obedience of soldiers serving a cause. It was the obedience of weapons serving a hand, and the hand was mine, and the hand wanted blood. Dorthan's trophies were the least of it. Vilsk's platoon had started marking itself, not with official insignia, not with regimental devices, with cuts, short diagonal lines scored into the backs of their left hands, opened fresh before every action, the blood wiped onto the weapon before they went in. The cuts were not deep enough to scar by accident. They were deliberate. They were ritual. By the end of the 2nd week in the Undercroft, Vilsk had stopped wearing the gauntlets, and his hand looked like something had been feeding on it, and when I saw it, I looked at my own and found 3 lines there that I did not remember cutting. In a regiment with a confessor in it, that is the point at which somebody stands up in front of the men and calls the thing by its name. We did not have a confessor. I had shot him in a communication sap 2 weeks earlier, and I had done it precisely so that nobody would stand up. Nothing was whispering in my ear. Every cut, every trophy, every kill, every night of dreamless sleep with a bloody sword in our hands was a choice. The thing in the drain was not making us do anything. It was agreeing with us. It had been broadcasting since before the first stone of the fortress was laid, and the broadcast was simple. Blood. Shed it, for any reason. Against any enemy. In any direction, the direction does not matter. The cause does not matter. The reason does not matter. The blood matters. Only the blood. Always the blood. We had been killing for the Emperor and the blood flowed. Now we were killing for ourselves and the blood flowed. The source was irrelevant. The killing was the point. 3 weeks in the Undercroft. The regiment, what was left of it, had cleared the eastern tunnel network and pushed into the foundations of the bastion of Relgart itself. We were underneath the fortress that Morvain had sent 3,000 men to die against on the surface, and we had reached it by going through the earth like worms through a corpse, and the image pleased me. We had lost 800 men in the tunnels. We were down to about 1,800. The men who survived were not the same men who had gone underground. Their faces had a thinness to them that was not starvation, a drawn quality around the eyes and the jaw that made them look like the faces on old icons, saints carved in stone, stripped of everything except the bone and the purpose underneath. Their eyes were clear. I noticed that on the 19th day, looking down the column during a rest halt, and the recognition hit me like a fist. Clear and calm and utterly free of the hollow exhaustion that had been eating them for months. I had seen that look once before, in the face of a cravaled corporal sitting in my communication sap with a last bolt in his thigh. I had shot him for it. Now my entire regiment was wearing it, and so was I. They did not talk much. They did not need to. Orders were given in gestures and received in motion, and the regiment moved like a single organism, a blade with 1,800 edges, and I was the hand that held it. We came up through the floor of Relgart's sub-basement on the 22nd day, into a storage level that had been converted into a barracks. 80 packed fighters sleeping in shifts. We killed them in 4 minutes. Not all of them were asleep. Some of them fought. Some of them fought well. It did not matter. We came out of the tunnels screaming, and the scream was the same scream I had heard from the packed fighters in the first month, the sound that announced presence to something that was listening. And the something was still listening, and it heard us, and for the first time I felt its attention, the way you feel sunlight on the back of your neck, warm and constant and unconcerned with your opinion about being warm. The assault on Relgard from below took 2 days. Tal took 800 men and drove upward through the western stairwells, floor by floor, drawing the Pact's reserves toward the noise and the muzzle flash. Nuldane held the sub-basement and the tunnels behind us with the remaining 400, because a force that fights upward without holding its exit route is a force that has volunteered to die in a box. I took 600 up the eastern spine of the building, the maintenance stairwell and the service corridors, the routes the Pact's fighters used to move between floors without exposing themselves to the main halls. The 2 assaults cost us 300 men between them, most of them in the first 4 floors, where the Pact fought for every landing. They fought with the desperate intensity of men defending their home, because Relgard was their home, had been their home for over a year, and we were in it, and we were not stopping. The second floor was a corridor 80 feet long, with apartment doorways down both sides, and the Pact had a stubber team at the far end firing straight down it. We lost 40 men taking that corridor, and we took it by going through the walls instead of the doorways, breaching charges and rifle butts, and in 2 places bare hands on plaster that had been softened by a year of damp, moving room to room parallel to the corridor until we came out behind the gun and killed the crew with knives. The third floor was worse because the Pact had learned from the second and had mined the interior walls. The fourth floor was a stairwell fight, 2 flights, 40 minutes, a dozen men at a time in a space that would comfortably hold 4, and I went up it in the front rank because the front rank was where the work was. Corporal Dorthan died on that stairwell. He went up past me when the man ahead of him fell, and he got 3 steps higher than anyone else had managed, and a Pact fighter opened him from hip to shoulder with a chain axe, and he went down still trying to climb. The wire of severed hands he wore across his chest went with him. Nobody cut it off him. Nobody would have dared. I led from the front because I had always led from the front, and the chainsword did its work. And I stopped counting kills somewhere on the 3rd floor because counting implied that the number was finite, and the number did not feel finite. It felt like a pipe that had been opened and would not close, a flow that ran through me from somewhere vast and dark and endless, and the sword was the valve, and the blood was the product, and the production line had no end-of-shift bell. By the 5th floor, the resistance had changed character. The Pact were no longer defending. They were dying in position, which is a different thing, and a soldier can tell the difference from 30 feet away. A man defending a position looks for cover and looks for support and looks for the moment to fall back. A man dying in position does not look for anything. He stands where he is and swings until somebody stops him. We killed 109 of them on the 5th floor and lost 22. And the exchange rate had finally, after 10 months on this world, tipped the other way. And I noticed that and felt nothing about it, except a mild professional satisfaction that the arithmetic had come around at last. The eastern stairwell went quiet above the 6th floor. Not because they were out of men. I could hear fighting from tall side of the building, which meant there were still plenty of men. They had stopped because the fighters on the eastern side had seen what was coming up the stairs and had decided that whatever was on the 7th floor could deal with it themselves or could not. And either way, they were not going to stand between the thing in the commissar's coat and the thing it was climbing toward. 3 packed fighters on the 7th floor landing looked at me as I came up the last flight. They looked at the sword and the blood and the men behind me. They stepped aside, not in surrender, in deference. The way a crowd parts for a procession it does not fully understand, but knows to respect. In a corridor of breached apartments that smelled like a tannery and looked like the inside of a wound, I found the command post. It was a large room, high-ceilinged, with windows that had been bricked up and walls that had been reinforced with salvaged armor plate. Skulls had been set into the mortar along the top of the plating, a course of them running the full width of the room like brickwork. And they were not arranged and not displayed, simply built in, the way a mason uses whatever he has. Some of them still wore Imperial helmets. In the center of the room, sitting behind a desk made from a vehicle hatch welded to 2 ammunition crates, was Hevroth Droon. He had a desk. Whatever else the Ashen Pact was, somebody in it had decided that a warband that size needed a place where things got written down. I had never seen the leader of the Ashen Pact. I had heard his name. The Pact fighters on the lower floors had spoken it the way soldiers speak the name of a storm they have survived, not with respect exactly, but with the understanding that arguing with weather is pointless. Intelligence reports at Division had described him as a warlord, a title that could mean anything from a gang leader to a minor chaos champion, and the reports had been vague about his origins and capabilities in the way that intelligence reports are vague when the intelligence is mostly guesswork and the analyst does not want to admit it. What I saw was a man, a big man, taller than me by a head, heavy through the shoulders and chest, wearing a coat that was so encrusted with dried blood that its original color was unrecoverable. His hands were scarred past counting, and the left one shook with a tremor that he controlled by gripping the desk edge. He was armed. A chain axe, heavier and uglier than anything the Pact's rank and file carried, lay across the desk in front of him, and a pistol, not a bolt pistol, but a stub revolver of archaic design, sat at his right hand. He was waiting for me. He had been waiting for me. The room was otherwise empty. His fighters were dead in the corridors below, or fighting in the corridors above, or gone, scattered into the undercroft to reform and return. He was alone, and he was sitting behind his desk, and he was smiling. He said, "How many?" I did not answer immediately. I was standing in the doorway with the chainsword in my right hand and the bolt pistol in my left, and blood on every surface of me, the coat, the boots, the face, the sash that I still wore because the sash is the symbol of the office, and I had not stopped being a commissar. I had simply changed employers. Droon waited. He was patient. He was a man who had been patient for a very long time, and who had learned that patience and violence are not opposites. They are sequences. I said, "How many what?" He said, "How many since you came underground?" I thought about it. I said, "I stopped counting." He said, "Good." That is when it begins." He stood up. He left the chain axe on the desk. He walked around the desk toward me, and he was not walking like a man preparing to fight. He was walking like a man approaching an equal, someone he had been expecting, someone whose arrival was not a surprise, but a confirmation. He stopped 10 feet from me, and he looked at me, at the coat and the sash and the pistol and the sword, and he nodded. He said, "You came through the Undercroft. 3 weeks, and you are still wearing the sash." He said it the way a man acknowledges a piece of craft, not impressed, not threatened, satisfied the way a foreman is satisfied when a part arrives that fits the machine he has been waiting to finish. He looked at the chainsword in my hand and at the blood on the blade and at the way I was standing, which was the way I always stood now, weight forward, hips open, the sword carried low and angled for a rising cut. He recognized the posture. He had been fighting men who stood like that for years, and he had been fighting men who did not stand like that for longer, and he knew the difference. He said, "I have been waiting for this for a long time, not for you specifically, for whoever came next. The garrison sends a regiment, the regiment holds the line grinds the regiment down, and eventually someone in the regiment decides that the line is the wrong place to be and comes looking for me. It happens every few years. The ones who come alone, I kill. The ones who come with men behind them, I test. I sent a man to talk to you on your second night down here, the way I have sent a man to talk to every one of them. You put a platoon into the passage and did not say a word. That was the first thing about you I liked. You came down with 2,600. You have 1,800 left, and my people have been stripping your dead for 3 weeks, so do not tell me I am wrong. You fought through the Undercroft for all of it, and you are still here and you are still hungry. That is the test." His figures were accurate to within a company. Somebody in that building had been keeping books on us since the morning we came down, and the fact that the man doing it was the one holding the axe told me most of what I needed to know about how the Ashen Pact was run. I said, "I did not come to be tested. I came to take what is yours." He smiled. He said, "Yes, that is the right answer." He picked up the chain axe. He left the revolver on the desk. A blade fight, then. Good. What I have of the fight is in pieces, and every piece is technical. That is what is left when the rest of it burns off. Droon was faster than a man of his size had any right to be, and stronger than any unaugmented human I had met. And his technique was not a soldier's technique. It was a butcher's technique, honed over years of tunnel fighting, stripped of everything decorative until only the cut remained. He swung the chain axe in short arcs that used the weapon's weight rather than fighting it, and each arc ended in a recovery that became the opening of the next strike, and the rhythm of it was like the rhythm of the heavy stubbers on the Korashad line, that steady grinding cadence that meant something was being processed. I fought him with the chainsword in one hand and nothing in the other because the bolt pistol was useless at this range, and I needed the free hand for balance. He was stronger. He was more experienced. He had been doing this for years beyond counting, and I had been doing it for 10 months, and the difference should have been decisive. It was not decisive because I was faster, and because I wanted it more. Not more than he did, but more than the version of me that had existed 10 months ago would have believed possible. The wanting was a physical sensation, a pressure in the chest and the throat and the hands, and it kept moving me forward into the arc of that axe at every point where a trained man would have given ground. The first exchange put me on the floor. He came at me off the mark with a downward cut that I did not so much block as survive, the chain axe skidding off my crossed guard and taking a fist-sized bite out of the door frame behind me, and the shock of it went up both my arms and into my shoulders, and my legs went out from under me. I went down on my back. He brought the axe over in a chop that would have opened me from sternum to hip, and I rolled, and it went into the floor beside my head, and the teeth threw stone chips into my face. I got a boot into his knee, not hard enough to break it, hard enough to buy the half-second I needed to get upright, and we separated and looked at each other across 8 feet of blood-slick floor, and he was smiling, and I was not. The second exchange lasted longer. I had learned the rhythm by then. He fought in threes, always threes, a high cut and a recovery and a low cut and a recovery and a flat horizontal sweep that came from his hips and carried the whole weight of him behind it. And after the sweep there was a gap, a quarter second where the axe was out wide and his chest was not covered. I took the gap on the fourth cycle. I came in under the sweep and put the chainsword into his side, below the ribs, and the teeth went in about 4 inches before they caught on the heavy leather beneath his coat, and I had to tear the blade back out sideways. He did not make a sound. He brought the axe back on the return and caught me across the ribs and the flak vest and the skin underneath. A cut I did not feel at the time and could not stop bleeding for 2 days afterwards. There was a third exchange, and I remember almost nothing of it. I remember that the left side of my coat was heavy. I remember that he was slower on the recovery than he had been at the start, and that the tremor I had seen in his hand at the desk had spread up into the forearm, and that he knew I had seen it. And I remember that he kept smiling all the way through, the way a man smiles at the end of a long shift when he can finally see the door. The fight lasted 4 minutes. I have that from the men in the corridor, who argued about it afterwards the way soldiers argue about anything they have watched and could not help with, and 4 was the number they settled on. 4 minutes of chain blade against chain axe in a room that was too small and too dark, and too full of the sound of motors and teeth and metal on metal, and the only sound louder than the weapons was the sound that was not a sound, the frequency, the broadcast, the thing beneath Veldaric, saying yes, 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 yes. I killed Hevroth Droon at the end of it. The chainsword went through his guard on a low angle, under the axe, up through the abdomen and into the rib cage, and the teeth caught on bone, and I drove it deeper and twisted, and his body did something that bodies do when the central structure fails, a kind of folding, and he went down onto his knees and his hands and then onto his side, and the chain axe fell from his grip and skittered across the floor, trailing sparks. He was not dead immediately. He lay on his side with the sword still in him, and he looked up at me, and there was nothing in his eyes except the thing that had been in them since I entered the room. The flat, steady glow of a man who has been burning for so long that he has forgotten what cold feels like. He made a sound that was not a word. It was the sound the pact fighters made in the tunnels, the announcement, the broadcast, and it rose out of him like steam, and it filled the room, and then it stopped, and he stopped, and everything stopped. I pulled the sword free. He died. The room was quiet except for the chain blade idling and the sound of dripping, which was blood. His blood, running across the floor toward a crack in the foundation that led down, always down. Everything on Veldaric led down. Vilsk was in the doorway. Behind him, the corridor was full of 91st soldiers, and behind them in the stairwells and the corridors beyond were pact fighters. Not fighting. Standing. The shooting had stopped. The entire building, 7 floors of close-quarters slaughter, had gone quiet the moment Droon hit the floor, as if someone had turned off a machine. The pact fighters were looking at me. My men were looking at me. Everyone was looking at the man with the commissar's coat and the bloody sword standing over the body of the man who had led them until 4 minutes ago. I walked to the desk. I picked up the chain axe. I put it on my back because I would need it later, and a man with 2 blades kills in 2 directions. I looked at the packed fighters in the corridor, and I said, in a voice that carried because commissars are trained to project, the previous management is under new ownership. The terms of employment have not changed. You fight, you die, you do not stop. Anyone who wants to renegotiate is welcome to take it up with me personally. Nobody renegotiated. That was a long time ago. I do not count the months anymore. The Ashen Pact numbers approximately 4,000 fighters now. 1,500 are mine, the remnants of the 91st Hentworth Rifles, although calling them the 91st is a formality that only I maintain, and only because the Commissar's habit of proper documentation dies harder than any other part of the Commissar. The rest are packed veterans who transferred their allegiance to me with the same pragmatism that soldiers everywhere display when the previous commander is dead on the floor and the new commander is standing over him holding the thing that killed him. And new arrivals. Deserters from the Korashhat line, men who crawled through the rubble and into the undercroft because the alternative was another dawn assault into another killing field for another commendation on cream-colored paper. Survivors of regiments that Morvain ground to powder and that the Munitorum declared destroyed and that the men inside simply refused to stop being. They come down to us. They come because the drain calls to them the way it called to me. A sound below sound, a frequency that the chest hears before the ears do. And the call is simple, and the call does not lie, which is more than the Imperium has ever managed. I talk to every one of them before they are assigned. They arrive carrying the Munitorum's account, which is that a commissar snapped, and a man who believes it will spend his first month down here waiting for me to snap again. So I tell it in order, from the parade square to this room, and by the end they have stopped waiting. Everything I have told you, I have told 2,000 men before you, and I will tell it again next week, and the week after, for as long as the Imperium keeps sending me the raw material. I still wear the coat. I still wear the sash. I still carry the bolt pistol on my hip and the chainsword on my left, and Droon's chain axe across my back. And I still walk the lines between 2 and 4 in the morning because that is when sentries sleep, and that is when a commissar earns his rations. And the fact that the lines are tunnel walls instead of trench walls, and the sentries are killers instead of soldiers, does not change the principle. A well-ordered unit kills more effectively than a mob, whichever direction it is pointed, and mine is very well ordered. I execute deserters. Desertion means something different now than it meant on the Korashhat line. A man who runs from the enemy is a coward, and cowards are waste. A man who stops fighting is worse, and there is no place for him in the Pact, or in the tunnels, or anywhere on Veldaric. The drain drinks the willing and the unwilling alike, but the willing taste better, and I have become a very particular connoisseur. 4 of them renegotiated later, at intervals, over the months that followed. 2 came at me together in a gallery off the 3rd sub-level. 1 came at me alone in a stairwell and got considerably closer than the 2 of them managed. The 4th was one of my own, a Hentworth man whose brother had died on the 5th floor of Relgart with a packed bayonet in him, and who could not be made to stand in a firing line beside the people who put it there. I did not hold that against him, and I killed him anyway, because the holding against is not the point, and never was. The arrangement is not complicated. Whoever is standing in the room is standing in it because nobody has yet taken it off him. I hold what I hold on exactly the terms Droon held it, and one morning somebody will come up the eastern stairwell with better hands than mine, and the terms will not have changed then either. That is the only part of any of this that I find restful. Tall is still alive. He commands the surface operations now, what used to be the Koroshat sectors that the Pact held before I arrived. He does not come underground anymore. He said once that the tunnels were changing him, and he did not want to change. I told him that the tunnels do not change anyone. The tunnels reveal. He did not answer. Tal is a practical man and a good colonel, and he knows that arguing with the Commissar is a waste of time regardless of which side the Commissar is on. He runs the surface. I run the dark. He stays because the Munitorum declared the 91st destroyed 8 months ago, and every man in the regiment is officially dead, and a dead man has nowhere to surrender to. Noldane runs the tunnel garrisons between us, which is the last captaincy the 91st has left, and the only one of the 4 still standing at the end. Between us we hold the eastern half of Veldaric Primus, from the Koroshat line to the deep Undercroft, and the garrison holds the west, and Morvaini holds his headquarters, and the Drain holds everything. Morvain is still sending orders. I know this because we intercept his signals traffic, which is not difficult because Morvain's signal staff are not very good, and our signal staff used to be his signal staff before they came underground. The same channel carried the Ministorum's answer about Camber eventually. A pronouncement of anathema, read out in shrines on every compliant world in the subsector, naming me and denying me fire, water, burial, and the Emperor's mercy in perpetuity. I have been without all 4 of those for a considerable time, and I have not noticed the difference. He is still ordering assaults, still writing commendations, still reporting to the Munitorum that the campaign is proceeding according to schedule, which it is, in the same way that a mill is proceeding according to schedule when it is grinding the operator along with the grain. New regiments arrive, they are deployed, they hold the line, they are ground down. The cycle continues. I would say I feel nothing about this, but that would be imprecise. I feel hunger, not for the men on the line. They are not prey, they are supply. Some of them will die on the surface and feed the Drain from above, and some of them will come down to me and feed the Drain from below. And the Drain does not care which, and neither do I. Because the blood is the blood is the blood, and the only question that matters is whether it is flowing, and it is always flowing on Veldaric. What happened to me was not the Imperium's fault. Morvain's orders were the occasion. They were not the cause. The cause was in me at Halecroft, the first time they put the bolt pistol in my hand, and the weight felt right. The Imperium gave me targets for 10 months, and then I found my own, and the supply has not run out and will not, because Veldaric is a world built for killing, and I am built for the same thing. The coat is heavier than it used to be. The blood soaks into the fabric and dries, and the next layer soaks in on top of it, and the coat gets stiffer and thicker and darker, and I have not cleaned it since the Undercroft, because cleaning it would be a waste of time, and because the weight of it feels correct. The sash is brown now, or close to brown. It was red when the Schola issued it. It has not changed color. It has simply become more of what it always was. I do not know what I am. The Commissariat has certainly struck my name from its rolls by now, entered a date of death, closed the file, shipped the replacement. I want the next fight. I want the weight of the chain axe on the downswing, and the sound the chainsword makes when it bites through flak plate, and the flat, wet percussion of the bolt pistol at close range. I want the silence after, the 2 or 3 seconds when the last body has fallen, and the next wave has not yet reached the barricade, and the world holds its breath. And then I want the silence to end. I want the silence to end, and it always does, and that is enough.